Hello and welcome back. In today's session, we're going to be learning about class. Yes, from our previous sessions, we've come quite a bit from where we began, learning about data types. We've come to also see things from our previous session about functions, and also went to the official Python library documentation, as it were. I trust you've also read up on that to also get yourself familiar with some things. So today is going to be the tipping point before we get into interacting with data or learning how to interact with external data on using Python, which is kind of like why you're here to use Python for data analysis. Now, before we just delve into that, I think it's important that we understand the key concept, and class. So in this class, we're going to learn about class in Python, class in object-oriented programming. And so, what is a class? You can easily search, to get a textbook definition of what a class is. However, uh, operationally, you could think of it as a space where you can, especially in contrast with when you have functions, so we have different functions, that we've been writing, from our previous session here. And perhaps um, you have a scenario where we have one, two, three, four. These four functions are interacting with similar variables or input types. So you just want that input value to be passed once, and then so all of them could use that value or variable. You could group you could group or put all of these functions under a class. Now, once they are in a class, they have a different name, expression for themselves. So that's just one way to look at classes. Now, there are more technical details about classes, but I'm just going to show you an introductory bit of classes, and I'll still implore you to also read up, from the official Python docs, to understand classes, or class rather, in a broader term. So let's just run with this. The first thing, similarly, rule of thumb when we're doing certain things, like for the function, we have to use the keyword def. So for the class, the important thing is you have to start with that keyword class and then the name of the class. So I'm just going to take this up here so we can see. So the name of the class, so I'm just going to say first class, first class here. Now, this other bit is optional. First class this is not optional, so you must write the keyword class and the name of the class. So certain rule of thumbs regarding names, same way we use certain rules. Those rules are applied for variables, for functions, typically, we apply them to also for class names. So then followed by a colon, right? So a colon is there, and then you move to the next line. Now, the next line is where you now pass properties of this class. Okay, properties of the class. So, uh, from what I just explained earlier, so you have group of functions or functions that you feel that they use similar inputs, they utilize similar input or the same variable. So you just want to group them up. So this is where you those things are part of the properties of the class. So a function could be a property of a class. A variable, could be a property of a class. Now, how these things are referred to, so you also don't get lost in conversations. For a function, you call it a method. So a method is simply a function that is under a class, that belongs to a class. And for a variable, it's popularly referred to as attributes. Okay, attributes or properties. So these terms, it's just good to get yourself familiar. So when you're in a space, you're also able to interact and also understand what other analysts or technical professionals are referring to. Okay. So having said that, now the scope of attributes, variables, as I just mentioned, within a class is also important to understand. I'm not going to go into that detail so you don't just get lost in it. The next thing you can see IntelliSense is just has written up some things here. I want to explain them. For this first one, I'm going to ignore this IntelliSense bit, and I'm still going to type in the def keyword, So by def, we know that we're trying to write the method or a function, right? So space, and then was also write the name of our function. So we have this thing that was saying here from IntelliSense is optional. Okay, now it's optional for you to type it in, but it's actually not optional for the class. If you do not type it in, that's what you're saying here, like dash dash. It's actually an underscore, an underscore, two underscore, and then the word in it, followed by another underscore, and then the parentheses because it's also a function. This first function, it's required in every class, is a constructor. Okay, I'm going to talk about that, but I just want to understand. If you do not specify, if you do not write out a constructor for you, a class that you're creating, like we're creating now in our first class, the program behind the scenes is going to write one for you on your behalf. So it's optional that if you feel you don't want to input one, the program is going to do one for you. So now let's talk about what is a constructor. It's the first method or first function in a class. So typically, the constructor is where you're specifying the template of your class. I personally I use it to specify how the variables, which are like the inputs that I'm speaking to, the variables of the class. Now, when you're done writing a class, just like a function, if it's not utilized, it's just idle. But when a function is called, so when a class is utilized or a class is called, that part that the class is being called is referred to that you're kind of like calling an instance of that class, an example of that class. If you think about it, just speaking, everyday speaking, from school, classroom terms, a teacher is teaching and they want to cite an example and I say, for instance, sorry, I was supposed to say for instance, I think the Afro pop part of me from Nigeria is just coming. For instance, it's actually a big song, in Nigeria to face. You can check that out. But let's come back to our conversation. So while teaching or sharing something, we do find ourselves using such terms, say for instance, and we go ahead to give a scenario. Okay. So similarly, when you're citing a class, you're calling a class, you're you're instantiating a class. That's not the word I want to use. You're using an instance of that class. So when you want to use an instance of that class, the way you would call it is the constructor, just as a constructor, you're constructing how the basis of which it is called. Um, I think I should start typing, so you could just see it a bit here. I think I'm just going to go ahead with this intelligence bit here. So I'm just going to type the underscore. I know I said I wasn't going to do it. Sorry, I'm just doing it. Okay. Yes, and then next my parentheses. Now I have the parentheses just as we know with our function call. The parentheses is where we pass the input, right? Because this is also is a function, like I said, because in the class the method. So this is where we specify the input, and so we know positional arguments, keyword arguments, you know, which we have covered. So, but the very first value that is passed, excuse me, in this function, in this constructor, it has the word self. Now, this self, if you also see intelligence has self in other areas, self is saying for every time this class is called, that instance, like I said, for instance, that instance of which the class is called, this the values, like the inputs, the variable, is what I want to be passed in. So that's what self is saying for this instance. So self is the for instance, for instance, it's funny, the first line is for instance, share with the one where they give chance. So for instance, if I was the one that was given chance, and that's what this constructor, I really didn't think of it this light before growing up. So for instance, and that's what the self is speaking to. That for this particular instance of the class, so here now we're saying first class. So when we're calling it, it's going to be saying for you to call first class, the values that you pass are local to that first class there, and this self, that's what this self is speaking to. Now there's another variation where if you do not want to specify self and you want to specify something else, that's a bit more advanced. I would employ you, as you read up on the documentation, you're also going to see and understand it. But this is the basis, of understanding classes here. So self. Now, the big thing I also want to speak about is that this self here, as the first argument passed in the constructor method, it's compulsory. At this point, I would like you to think of it that you must actually write self first, excuse me, as a positional argument, and you can leave it. Now, this name here is speaking to when the constructor is called. So the constructor, is the first function which I've mentioned of the class, first method of the class, serves as the template, the blueprint. Yeah, the blueprint for the class. So anytime that class is being called, it's looking for that pattern. Same way when we're dealing with functions for positional argument. If you miss out on a positional argument, we got the error you call where it said, oh, this function is expecting two arguments, only one was provided. It's expecting three, two, or four were provided. So this is where we're specifying it. Another key thing about the self is this first part of the self that is written here. Yeah, nothing is passed to it. You're using it so you can easily reference it down here. So I'm also just going to type in self, right? And let's go say name here. It's also even saying age. I'm just going to play along with this because it's fine. And should I use what else should I use? Let's say hobby. Okay, hobby here. And so we have the colon, and it's indented. So now we're saying for any time is passed, self.name, self.age, self.hobby. That's to say the instance of this class that is being called is going to be equal to the value name that is going to be passed in here. Self.age is going to be equal to the value of age that is passed in here. So these are positional arguments. Of course, if you want keyword arguments or you want to pass default values in here, you could also easily do that here. Okay, to pass that in here. So now we come down here and exit, the constructor method, of the class, and write our own preferred method, in the class. So I'm just going to also say about. I'm going to call this about info. About info. Yeah, and print dot image. I think I also want to pass another print statement. So you recall we did something about where we're testing, the print pattern. So I'm just going to also test that here to see. Let's scroll up to where do we have that again? I just want to use the f string. Okay, so I'm going to say um sorry, I'm going to say self.name, which is that name variable, right? Self.name. I want this to state that this is a is, so I'm just going to say, okay, fine. They got that all figured out, right? So now this is the second method in this first class. Now I want to call this class. Okay, I want to call this class. So to call this class simply, I would simply say, let me just say call. I don't know why it's so difficult to just say, to just give these names. uh, should I say for instance? So I think I'm going to just go with that for instance. Right? I'm going to go with for instance. And now I'm calling the class to say first class, right? And I have to pass these values in there. So I have to pass the value from the constructor method here. I have to pass the value. So I want to pass a name. What's my name again? Okay, I'm going to say Belema, right? And I want to say Belema's age. So you know what, fine. I'm just going to go with what 36 has put in here, right? And this is what I'm going to leave. Now I've called this class that we created. Okay. Now because I've called it, all the properties of this class are now accessible because this is an instance of the class. Okay, this is an instance of the class. So to access it, to access any of the methods, yeah, what I simply have to do now is to say for this instance here, right, with a dot notation, okay, and I just simply say about info. I say about info. I can even go ahead to print, but let's just see what happens when this is executed. Okay, so if I were to execute this, okay, so we still get an error. We get the output of name is this, name is that, but then for this here, print self, so there's an error and the name f is not okay. So I didn't pass this correctly, right? I didn't pass this correctly. So I didn't pass this correctly. So I need to do this correctly. And that should be okay, there was a comma there. Just going to take that off. Take it double quotes. So that was an S string. So I'm going to run that again. And yes, so we can see Belema is 25 years old and loves coding. Okay. So just to go over it again, so the first thing while you're writing a class, even if you do not specify the constructor method, so the constructor method is something that is always created. So if you do not write one, the application is going to write one for you. Now it's good to always write one yourself, because it is the basis on which your class is built and utilized. So that's so let's just tweak something here now. Value let's not pass a value, right? Let's not pass a value in here and try to execute, and let's see what happens. So we have an error, so let's go back to see. I was saying type error first class dot, so it's referencing init, right? Init, the constructor method, is missing one required positional argument, which is hobby here. And we could, we know we can pass default arguments. So if we say, for instance, Prema actually likes playing badminton, he also loves playing football too. Because we know this is having a default argument, in here, it's going to run. If I were to also change it, to something else, to something I also like to do, playing football. Good one there. It also overwrites it. But back to it. So the first thing is the rule of thumb. You have the class keyword, the name of the class, and then your constructor method. The constructor method, as you can see, is the basis which your class is built. It's the basis which your class is built and which your class is also utilized. So if group of functions, so perhaps we want more things, want to do more things with all of these input in here, we could also write another method, which is another function to that would also have access that would also have access so I can say more about that could have more access, not more access, that could do more things, but it still has access to the same um, values, the same attributes. So yeah, it's just saying we don't need this. So I'm just going to comment this out. So print name is age, yeah, allows football. Since these are just string types, we're not really doing any particular thing with it. So could also just say, for instance, more about, so it's executed, and if we do that, we still get the same response here. I think I should just tweak that so that you know that this is a different one. Okay, so we see that this is a different one. But key things, the constructor method, first method, where you decide, you're setting it up like, well, this is uh how you want your class to be constructed. And so anytime the class is being called, just like a function, your class is being used, it those values, those things that you've set as the template must be returned. They must be imputed. Sorry, all that. They must be imputed into that call or instance of your class. Okay, a very popular way of which this is taught, is using cars. Okay, so here you can see this already written out. Say class type is car, and then in the constructor method we have brand model. Brand model. You could also say color. Okay, if you want, you could also just say color, right? I'm not going to, so I'm just going to say color here. Now, for every time this is going to be passed, it must be returned. Yeah, what's it called? A value should also be passed for color. At this point here, when it's being executed, it executes correctly to say FD9 says honk. But watch what happens when I do this. It's now expecting a positional argument of color. Okay, so I also have to, and where's the call here? This is the call here. So if I say white, for instance, and I run, now it's executed. Okay, I didn't say anything about it returning the value, but it doesn't see any error. But the class, the code executes correctly because here I also passed a value that was specified, in one of the arguments at the constructor method level. Okay, so first things, you're writing your class, the class keyword, the name of the class, and then you specify, your constructor method, which is your basis, your template, blueprint, which any of these terms, that applies better to you or resonates better with you, you know, just use that to understand that this is the first building block of the class. Now, interestingly, when you use a class, which is basically calling an instance of the class, that is the core, of object-oriented programming. Okay, because everything is an object. So an object is basically an instance of a class. And within these few minutes, we have just touched, of the same. We have just seen what the concept of O.O.P really is, right? So it's a class, and then you're drawing an instance of a class. So you're just the same way for this our class, our first class here. Here we have two more methods, right? Which are the methods that you use to perform operations. Okay, so you don't ever call you almost it's very rare just that you're calling the init because it's a constructor method. Okay, so you're using it for templates. Just think about it when you're building your house. You rarely go to alter the foundation. Okay, so you have the init, which is your constructor method, where you actually specify building blocks. If you also wanted to build, a calculator, stuff like that, this is where you want to specify, oh, numbers are coming in, right? How do you want these numbers? How do you want those numbers coming in now to be interacted with? Is where you now start writing other methods, which are functions, perhaps an addition method, multiplication, subtraction method. I know as I'm saying some of these things, it's kind of like drawing up ideas. And one of the best ways is to actually start typing this out. You get an error, it's not something that you should be so scared of. No matter the error you get, part of the process is figuring it out. You can share your errors here. You can also search online. There are tons of persons, who are eager to help. As long as you're open to learning, you will always get help or assistance where the case arises. So please share your thoughts, questions, if you have any regarding what we've shared. And in our next session, which is not going to be our next class, but our next session, we're going to be going into data, working with data analysis with Python. Thanks again for tuning in. Can't wait to see you in the next one. Bye for now.